Thank you all for coming to this week's Asking Different Questions uh, session on unintended bias in the language and metaphors of science. This session is to encourage us not so much to think about individual bias, which I think is often what we talk about where implicit bias takes place, but to think about how implicit bias is actually already set up in the language that we use. That can impact how we treat other people, but also on a more fundamental level, impact what we feel like is possible in terms of scientific discovery and process. My name is Sarah McCullough. I am the Associate Director at the Feminist Research Institute, and this project is funded by a National Science Foundation Innovations in Graduate Education grant. This series takes place at the UC Davis Feminist Research Institute, where we're working to build more just futures through leadership, inquiry, and collaboration. And crucial to that for us is bringing insights from the fields that we know well of feminist studies and I would also say critical race theory into different disciplines. And so asking different questions is designed to do exactly that, and specifically for STEM research. And we feel that this program can give people the intellectual foundations to do more justice-oriented STEM research. In other words, if you have an orientation towards justice, we can provide you with the intellectual backing to ground that work. Okay, so our agenda for today, first we will be discussing foundational concepts and giving a general introduction to the topic. I will go on to give a fairly rapid fire presentation of different types of metaphors that we might want to think about, then giving you some discussion questions and just some closing thoughts. And for this particular unit, this is one that I really encourage you to think about in relationship to your own field. So as I'll be going through these metaphors, as I'll be talking about this, I encourage you to think about what the metaphors are in your own field that may have in many ways been useful, but also may be metaphors that you want to also think outside of. Okay, so two foundational concepts today, and I'm going to kind of give an illustration of both. First, just metaphors themselves, and this is really more just to gesture towards the way that language and metaphors shape our abstract thinking. They have material consequences in the sense that language will impact what we feel like is possible to, say, even discover or to even do, perhaps, in the lab. Or how that work moves outside of the space. I want to give an example from a recent issue of Catalyst, Feminist Science and Technology Studies Journal article. It was an interview with Anna Soto, who is a feminist scientist, and a PhD student, Grayson Brillmeyer. Anna Soto has done a lot of work on endocrine disruptors. And she points out in a really interesting way how some of the limitations to regulation around endocrine disruptors is not just industry interests, which obviously play a large part, but also the language and metaphors that are currently pervasive in the field of biology. And how those metaphors actually cause an implicit capitulation to a logic that maybe shouldn't hold. In this case, these are metaphors that have been transferred from the fields of mathematics to biology, specifically thinking about biological systems as programs, as having signals, thinking about them as information transfer, for example, like the human brain as a computer. These are all very powerful metaphors. They're also limited because they are exactly that. They are ways of thinking about something that is not actually totally reflective of the material reality of how those systems operate. And so in this case, she points out how the use of those mathematical metaphors imply that we should privilege mechanisms, knowing the direct mechanism, in this case, for how endocrine disruptors are actually on a molecular level working. And if we can't find that out, then we don't have enough evidence to, say, legislate or regulate against them. And a quote she uses to demonstrate this, she says, "The idea that everything has to be explained via molecular mechanisms is not an immutable law of nature, but a philosophical stance called reductionism." And so she's calling this out to say this, this is a limitation in how we as scientists are thinking about this, that is allowing industry to, in a sense, exploit our logic to prevent legislation of something that they have very good reason to believe is detrimental to our health. Okay, so one of the ways that we can really demonstrate or determine how metaphors are affecting our thinking is by using a method of a textual analysis called close reading. And this is a method that is derived from literary studies and that looks very closely at how language is used to show what unspoken assumptions and cultural beliefs are implicated in the word choice. And I'm going to provide you all with an example that is studying specifically the egg and sperm and the way that fertilization has been historically described in biological textbooks. This is from an article written by Emily Martin, an anthropologist who looked at a lot of biological textbooks to really see how language was being used to gender the egg and the sperm in ways that were fundamentally limiting, not only to, in a lot of different ways, as you'll see. So I'm going to go ahead to the next screen so you can see. So, you can read along with me because in close reading, it's always helpful to have many ways to look at the language. Okay. How is it that positive images are denied to the bodies of women? A look at language, in this case, scientific language, provides the first clue. Take the egg and the sperm. It is remarkable how femininely the egg behaves and how masculinely the sperm. The egg is seen as large and passive. It does not move or journey, but it passively is transported, is swept, or even drifts along the fallopian tube. And I'll step in and note here, like very explicitly, she's also pointing out passive voice, like the passive verbs in this, the is, as if we don't know what's really actually doing the action here. The egg is clearly not the actant. In utter contrast, sperm are small, streamlined, and invariably active. They deliver their genes to the egg, activate the developmental programming of the egg, and have a velocity that is often remarked upon. Their tails are strong and efficiently powered. Together with the forces of ejaculation, they can propel the semen into the deepest recesses of the vagina. For this, they need energy, fuel, so that with a whiplash-like motion and strong lurches, they can burrow through the egg coat and penetrate it. And I should note that each of these quotes are quotes that she's taking directly from biology textbooks to talk about the fertilization process. So we can see here, like what she's pointing out to us is how the use of verb choice and tense is directly creating the egg as a passive sort of receptive vessel, whereas the sperm is active and enacting, almost a sort of like violence against the egg. I imagine many of us can immediately see the somewhat disturbing implications if we think about this in terms of, male-female relationships that are, clearly being, I would say, we could strongly argue, are being imposed onto the egg and the sperm. And beyond that too, Martin also points out how this framing actually is contrary to actual processes of fertilization. So as I'm sure anyone on this call who studies human development and fertilization, can attest. So it's something that one, perpetuates harmful cultural stereotypes, and two, actually is not representative of material phenomenon of fertilization. So I'm not going to do nearly as close a reading on the examples that follow. The rest are meant to be more provocative and just to encourage you to think about the metaphors in your own field. I'll also note that just because I'm pointing out a metaphor as perhaps having a limitation, it doesn't mean that in some contexts it may not be representative or it may not be doing good things for scientific discovery. As I'll reinforce at the end, what's really important about language and metaphors is knowing what they do well and what they don't do well, because metaphors will always have a limit. And when we know those limits, we can actually use them more responsibly. Okay, so another gendered metaphor that is pervasive in academia is this implied difference between hard and soft sciences, which has this sort of gendered relationality of the masculine being hard, the feminized being soft. Another gendered sort of coded gendered metaphors we see in the contrast between competition versus collaboration, a sort of differentiation we often see, say, in fields of ecology and other areas as well. There's many, many more we could go on here, but I'll move on to some other areas. This one, heterocentrist presumptions of monogamy. In other words, what we're talking about here is sort of the implicit privileging of sexual reproduction in a sort of like in a monogamous pairing. This is something that is most common in the study of animal behavior, as feminist science studies scholar Angela Willey points out to us. In her book, Undoing Monogamy, she points out how sometimes sexual fidelity and social pair bonding can, one, either become conflated, which obviously they are not the same thing, or one can become privileged over the other. And most specifically, she argues that sexual fidelity is often privileged over social pair bonding. And similarly, she argues that mating behaviors are often privileged or seen as implicitly more important in studies than cohabitation. And what both of these do is that they point out sexual reproduction as the privileged activity, rather than, say, the reproduction of the conditions to sustain life. So she's essentially arguing that if we really think about animal behavior, we should be looking at both of these things and examining what may actually be the more important thing to be studying. Okay, oops, wrong way. The next type of metaphors I want to talk about are ones that may contain ideas of xenophobia. These can be more common in studies of ecology, studies of plants and animal systems, and specifically when we talk about the difference between, like, quote unquote native and non-native plant and animal life. Obviously, the introduction of new species into an environment can have profound effects on that environment because of the very relationality of life. The pervasiveness of the language of invaders, aliens, is language I think we should be much more cautious about our usage than we often currently are, especially in the current environment of the US, where xenophobia is often all too common. And there's been a number of studies pointing out how the use of this language around plants and animals can actually feed ideologies about xenophobic attitudes toward people, particularly anti-Asian sentiments. And this is also exacerbated by the sensationalized language that can often accompany this sort of literature. Like we see here, we have quotes, these quotes like, "I was stunned. It was like the aliens had landed. Now we've lost this ecosystem forever." So while that may be, reflective of a sort of affect and a sort of like impact that needs to be attended to, when paired with language of invaders and aliens, it can reinforce sort of unconscious ideologies that perhaps we really don't want to be promoting. The next category, militarization, I would say is sort of like a subtopic of gendered metaphors in a way, as militarization is often very strongly tied to masculinity, but is pervasive enough, definitely I would say, to merit its own attention. we see these metaphors very often in healthcare and medicine. There are many diseases that we have declared war on. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, is this really the right way to think about working with disease? Because talking about war as as the quote that introduces this article implies, this is something where it implies there will be casualties, there will be prices that we need to pay to win. It implies one that we can win, and that winning will look like a particular thing, which this often may not be the case when we're talking about human health systems. And I think it's also worth questioning, is destruction the right metaphor for something that lives in our bodies? Sometimes, conditions that may actually arise, say, like from our own bodies, from genetic conditions or worlds that our bodies are forced to live in. But ultimately, conditions that are a part of who we are. Is destruction really how we want to think about it? Are there other ways? And there are other metaphors people have suggested. Um, Another way to, I think that's worth attending to in militarized metaphors is thinking about targeted drug delivery. The targeted imagery, while helpful in many ways, might also threaten to undermine the complexity of the use of pharmaceuticals in our body systems. While we may have an ideal of targeting just this very specific thing, that often may not be the case in terms of its actual operation, and those metaphors can threaten to erase the complexity. Next, I want to point towards metaphors of waste. These are metaphors that imply implicitly like some things are valued over others. The example I want to use for this is one that I think we're all really familiar with, and that I think has actually done a lot of good, which is the idea of the pipeline, this pipeline that we want to keep, particularly people talk about keeping women and girls in STEM. And it's a really powerful metaphor. It's a metaphor that has resulted in practices that have had, really clear material benefits on people's lives. And I in no way want to, to undermine them. This is more about also recognizing limitations of the metaphor, along with the power that it has for many. One of the impacts it also has is to imply that women who, quote unquote, like drop out of the pipeline, or who leak out are, somehow waste or not, or a failure in some way, shape, or form. And this is a sentiment that some women who have chosen to move out of STEM careers for, whatever their own reason is, have said has left them with feeling a sense of guilt, a sense of lesser for doing that, for making that choice. Obviously, this is, just one metaphor doesn't do that, but the pipeline metaphor, can kind of feed that kind of rhetoric. Next, I'm going to point out some examples of ableist metaphors, and ableism being the presumption that presuming the supremacy of able-bodiedness and taking this as the norm. I could say a lot more about that, but I'll leave it at that for now. These are most common in the examples I was looking at within genetics, but just medical practice in general. The study of the Human Genome Project would think about that they were finding a book that would help them to fix a flawed machine, implying that those with disabilities were somehow, again, like lesser flawed. I'll note in this example too, we also see some metaphors that are implicated in colonialism, specifically this idea of mapping a mysterious wilderness, which is akin to the use of ideas of breaking new frontiers. These references to frontiers and wilderness do recall histories of colonialization, which were also highly violent and acts that led to genocide, that led to destruction of many natural environments. And so it's worth thinking about when and how we're using those metaphors, if they're really what we want to be using. Do we want to be glorifying that process, which implicitly, when we talk about frontiers, breaking new frontiers is a good thing, does. Um, just saying a little bit more about the ableist metaphors. The Human Genome Project was also often referred to as the Book of Life, and that book metaphor, while really powerful, also produced the idea that we could sort of find these textual errors. We would see disabled bodies as defective text that we could fix, and these are all sort of rhetorics that those within the disabled community and working within the disability justice movement would highly contest. Okay, so there's also, we can point out racist metaphors. I'm going to talk about one that is like, just really obvious in terms of its linguistic use, but there's also many others that, settle more around in the cultural presumptions and presumptions that we make in the formation of research questions. This example of master slave metaphors are refer to metaphors used within programming and computer languages that have been challenged, that have been changing, but continue to be used in an ongoing debate. This from being outside of these fields, this is a very strange and surprising metaphor that it still exists, but it does, and it's worth thinking about how even the existence of that language may be exclusionary, and may actually, even as this article is arguing, may actually not even be the best representation of the systems that are being used. A specific sort of term I want to bring up that I think is also worth attending to is the term misogynoir, and this refers specifically to the denigration of Black women. It's a term that was coined by Moya Bailey. I'm putting a link up in the chat so you can learn more about this term if you are so interested, and its popularization. This is a phenomenon that is pervasive in our culture and history. And this article sort of points out specifically how they see it being perpetuated in the way that obese Black women are sort of imagined in public health research. I would also point out how this is an example of a deficit-centered language that is often present when studying Black women, as well as Black communities and communities of color. This implication that somehow they are at fault, there is a deficit that we must solve, rather than looking at broader systemic issues or deficits within within systems outside of them, perhaps. So I've just given you, a whole bunch of examples of metaphors that we may want to stop and think twice about. Again, as I said before, this isn't to say that these metaphors are like bad or wrong necessarily, but just that we should think carefully about what they are doing well that we like, and what they may be doing that we maybe not want to encourage. So I'm going to give you a few alternative metaphors that revolve around craft. This is sort of like a historically feminized practice, and that I think does something different in how we think about, scientific phenomena and processes. There's lots of other alternative metaphors out there. I'm just kind of throwing these out there as a place to start your thinking, hopefully. This author suggests that we may think about quilting as a metaphor for scientific inquiry, and the thinking about the knowledge production in science as quilting, rather than, as they say, like exploring, hunting, penetrating the unknown, can lead to a much different dynamic in terms of the social relations of science and the ways that we relate to our areas of study. I am throwing in there protein folding. Obviously this describes a very material phenomenon, but I find it interesting. It sort of is using, the sort of like folding metaphors that elicit, again, much different sorts of relations in thinking about them than other metaphors we've talked about today. And finally, I wanted to bring to your attention metaphors of papercraft, specifically kirigami, a type of origami that has inspired different ways of folding and shaping nanoparticles. Okay, so that was a quick run through. And before we go, I just wanted to leave you with these questions. Again, some of you will be having your own discussion groups after this, or if you're not, I invite you to think about these on your own or perhaps in conversation. First, what are the dominant linguistic, instrumental, and practice-based metaphors of your field? Two, how do these metaphors help the scientific process? So again, what do they do well? And how do these metaphors limit the scientific process? Where might you know where they're maybe not serving you as well anymore? Three, how are these metaphors linked to the histories of the field and patterns of exclusion? Like, are those metaphors, may those metaphors be less palatable to others because of histories of exclusion? And how can we better attend to that? And four, what new metaphors have arisen in the past decade or so, and how have they advanced the field? Oftentimes, when really foundational or innovative new discoveries are made, they are accompanied by a change in the metaphors and language and sort of like, models through which we think about a phenomenon. To borrow from one, science study scholar, sort of like whenever we see sort of like revolutions in a particular field, they are often also linguistic revolutions in a way. So I leave you with this last quote that is meant to help us think about the power of language. I'll read it out loud. It matters what matters we use to think other matters with. It matters what stories we tell to tell stories with. It matters what knots not knots, what thoughts think thoughts, what descriptions describe descriptions, what ties tie ties. It matters what stories make worlds, what worlds make stories. And what I really want this quote to point towards to all of you is just the power of attending to the assumptions and the presumptions that are underneath whatever we're talking about. And the more we can attend to that, the more aware we will be of those sort of more subconscious cultural biases that may be inflecting our work. And the more we do that, the better we can actually produce valid and accurate scientific knowledge that is also socially responsible. Okay, so thank you all for going with me in this sort of whirlwind through metaphors and language. As I said, next week we will be shifting topics. Instead of talking about making more accurate knowledge and objectivity, we will be talking about hierarchy and accountability, a topic that most definitely relates to scientific research, to academia, but also to the other areas of our lives and worlds. And so I include that, so it's a topic that we can all think about and apply in the area that feels most appropriate to us. If you have any questions, please reach out at fri@ucdavis.edu or visit us on our website. If you are having a discussion, or if you'd like to start a discussion in your own local research community, you can email us to ask for some facilitation materials, and I'm happy to provide those. So thank you again, and hope to see you all next week.